We're coming at you large. We're coming at you live. The Linux distro community, Total OS Today, and Spatry's Cup of Linux presents the Linux Zoo Crew, episode 29, live. Before we start today's show, I would like to share a few words with you from the founder of this magnificent community.
Hi, I'm Voltam, founder of the Linux distro community. The Linux distro community is a place for people to hang out and discuss Linux distros, software, and open source. The Linux distro community is a community funded by its members for its members. We are a friendly, welcoming community that encourages people who use Linux operating systems and software to share their passion and knowledge with other people. We believe that when people share information freely, everyone benefits. We'd love to see you become a part of the Linux distro community. You can voice chat with us on Mumble or text chat with us in IRC. Head over to linuxdistrocommunity.com for details. Join in today in the sharing of knowledge and the freedom that a Linux operating system gives people. Thank you.
Thanks, Voltam. And now I'd like to pass the mic to my co-host, Total OS Today, who will introduce our guests and take his usual pot shots at me.
No, I'm saving that for the news and nonsense spot. But anyway, for the Linux Zoo crew, we have Matthew Moore, Shaggy 2 Dope, of course, Spatry, Swath, and myself, the ever humble, shy Toss today. Spatry, take it away.
So tell me, I'm glad that you were able to make it tonight. So I take it you decided not to do any fishing with dynamite this weekend?
No, I'm taking it easy, thank you.
All right. Today is a double header because Total West Today is not going to be able to make it tomorrow night for the News and Nonsense Report. So the News and Nonsense Report will follow today's controversial topic. To GNU or not to GNU? Should we be required to say GNU before Linux? Say Toss today. How come I don't hear you saying GNU Linux in your shows on YouTube?
I'm trying to keep my show simple and not to confuse newbies. You really want me to add more syllables to Linux?
So what do you think? Toss today.
I have to be honest, when you PM me the topic, two things popped into my mind. Number one, I didn't realize that there was a controversy whether to call, Linux GNU Linux or just Linux. And the second thing that popped into my mind, running a newbie channel, why should I care? So I'm hoping to learn something here tonight because this is something I never thought of. And to be honest, I'm not really sure I do care. I mean, I understand the politics behind it and the history behind it, but I'm not sure for newbies, at least for my channel, if that's really that important.
Yeah, and some people will argue, that it's easier to say. It rolls off the tongue a lot easier, and some newbies, may think that GNU Linux is different from Linux, and especially with all those distributions that we have available out there, Ubuntu, your Fedoras, and all the spins that are available out there, and all these choices. This is just yet another thing that complicates things for the newcomer. Yes. How do you see it, Matthew Moore?
Well, when I first was introduced to Linux, that's what people called it. That's how I was introduced to it. I didn't even realize that there was such a thing as GNU/Linux until I had already been using the platform for a while. So it's just not something that I ever got into a habit of calling it.
How about you, Shaggy 2 Dope?
I've always been more attuned to the GNU philosophy. That's what attracted me to Linux. So I've always sort of approached it by calling it that. But it's still called Linux because, as Toss today said, it does make it simpler for a new person to understand just in simple conversation.
Swath.
Yep, I'm much in the same boat. I think when I was first introduced to it, it was just simply referred to as Linux, and then I didn't really hear about the whole naming controversy until after I'd been using it for a while. So out of habit, I say Linux, but if I'd been better trained and in the habit of saying it, I would say GNU/Linux.
Now, interestingly enough, for those of you who have followed my show from the very beginning when I started almost 2 years ago, I actually said GNU Linux. I didn't realize that it was pronounced GNU Linux. I just said GNU Linux, and I took a lot of heat from the community because I wasn't pronouncing it right, and I wasn't doing it intentionally to tick anybody off. Not at all. I was trying to, give call it what I thought it was supposed to be called. And the thing is, this is a Stallman thing where GNU has contributed a lot, and when we think about these Linux distributions and that sort of thing, they do use GNU software. Okay, now Linux, of course, is the kernel, and then a distribution has all of these applications piled on top of the kernel. Now, when Linus Torvalds was asked in the documentary Revolution OS whether the name GNU Linux was justified, this was his reply, and I'm quoting, "Well, I think it's justified, but it's justified if you actually make a GNU distribution of Linux. Same way that I think that Red Hat Linux is fine, or SUSE Linux, or Debian Linux, because if you actually make your own distribution of Linux, you get to name the thing. But calling Linux in general GNU Linux, I think, is just outrageous." What do you say to that, Matthew?
Well, if you make your own distribution, you can name it whatever you want, but on that token, should we even be calling it Linux? Because a lot of these developers that make these distributions, a lot of them modify the kernel to the point where it's not the way it was when it started. So should it even be called Linux for that matter? Should we just call Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, and so on and so forth? I don't know.
Shaggy.
The naming convention that's used for describing what the entire ecosystem is what's important. Everything's referred to as Linux, even the Android phones, and you have to really think about it because it's not always Linux. It's not the same ecosystem that you have on your desktop. You not everything's the same. A lot of distributions modify the kernel, and when it's shipped out, it's not really what it was. So it doesn't deserve to be called Linux. It should just be called Ubuntu. But people throw in Linux to identify what it is.
Swath, what do you think?
Well, if you look at a distribution, say Debian, like they do a release with the herd kernel, so it's using GNU tools and the compiler and stuff, and it's not even using the Linux kernel. But I've heard people say, "Oh, I'm using Linux, but I'm using the herd kernel," but they're not using Linux. So I think everything, to put it simply, is a variant of GNU/Linux. But I mean, we simply refer to it by their release name, whether it's Gentoo or Arch or Debian or Ubuntu, and the actual use of the word Linux itself is declining more and more now as well.
Now, interestingly enough, if you go on to the Debian website, they affirm that their distribution is GNU Linux, and if you're using the herd, it's called GNU Herd. Total OS Today, what do you think?
Well, I sometimes get comments like something like, "Dude, Linux, is not a operating system; it's a kernel." And of course, I understand that, but sometimes I have to explain it to the newbies who might say, "What's a kernel?" Well, think of it as a bridge. Okay, on the left side of the bridge, you have the hardware. Okay, on the right side of the bridge, you have the software. And what bridges those two things? That's the Linux kernel. But getting back to the naming and stuff, to me, it really doesn't matter either way if we're going to call it GNU Linux or just Linux. Sometimes I'll say, Ubuntu something review or Ubuntu Linux. That's something for the newbies. And sometimes I just put it out there just to put it out there for no particular reason. But getting back to the name, whether it should be called GNU Linux or just Linux, I know this is a Linux show, but you guys, or at least Spatry knows that I do dual boot between Windows and Linux. So let me poke fun at Windows for a second. Let's speculate, for example, next year that Windows 9 comes out, or 9.1 or whatever. Microsoft says, from now on, we will call this Microsoft Windows and not just Windows. My reaction would be this. It would be a yawn because it doesn't change anything. Now, if they said from 9.0 on, Microsoft Windows, we will be able to eliminate 99% of the viruses out there, now they got my attention. But Microsoft Windows, GNU Linux, if we put the GNU in front of Linux, Spatry, does anything really change?
Now, there is something where Stallman makes a point on why they should call it. Before I get to that, I just want to mention a few things that were said on IRC. Armageddon wanted to point out that the herd is GNU, so essentially That would be GNU. GNU. I think am I right in that interpretation, Armageddon? Also, Linux is today states even if they wanted to change the name to GNU Linux, it's kind of late and a bit of adjustment in getting used to, which creating a whole new brand practically is not really a good move. Now, Richard Stallman had to say this. Okay, so we got to give credit to, GNU and all these, because Linux distributions use technologies from other vendors and programmers and that sort of thing. So does that mean we need to now call it TeX/Perl/GNU/X11/Apache/Linux?
Yeah, no problem.
Well, since a long name becomes absurd, at some point you will have to set a threshold and omit names of many other secondary contributions. There is no one obvious right place to set the threshold. So wherever you set it, we won't argue against it. But no one name cannot result from concerns of fairness in giving credit, not for any possible threshold level. This Linux, it can't be fair to give all the credit to one secondary contribution while omitting the principal contribution, GNU. And that was something that Richard Stallman had stated. Now,
you have to respect him. He's one of the founding fathers for the free software movement, right?
Exactly. And the thing is, most Linux distributions out there today that we are using use GNU tools, such as its compiler. Some use Emacs, which is a GNU product as well. Now, one person stated in one of the forums as I was reading this, they stated, and I don't know if there's any truth to this, but one person had stated if GNU projects wanted to gain larger relevance, it should contribute more code and should be a friendly platform for contributors instead of aggressively trying to language lawyer themselves into the naming of other projects. And in this same article that I was reading, the Linux Journal was quoted at this, in that they speculated that Stallman's advocacy of the combined names from frustration, that Linus Torvalds got the glory for what Stallman wanted to do.
Well, do you think that Linus, Torvalds was the first to try and bring this movement, the open source OS kernel mainstream, to the mainstream?
Well, I realize that, GNU should get some credit because obviously when Linux was in its infancy, basically they had all of these tools. The GNU project had all these tools and everything. They just did not have a kernel to put all of this onto to get everything to work together. And so in the early days, yes, I imagine it was more appropriate to call it GNU Linux then than probably today, because that raises a question. How much GNU is in a modern Linux distribution today? And according to my research, Ubuntu Natty Narwhal only had 8% GNU software in its distribution.
How much is in there? Like we joked last week, everything is so forked up, right?
Exactly. But what about Linux distributions that do not contain any GNU software at all? Android being the most prominent example. Is it possible to run Linux? Is it possible to run Linux without GNU? Absolutely. You can use alternatives to GNU software. Let's pass the microphone around and see if anybody else has any views on this. We'll start with you, Matthew.
Well, the whole idea that the GNU project has a lot of credit due to them, I think I agree with that, because in the beginning, it was pretty much their idea. They started this whole free software concept. And without the contributions that they provided, we probably wouldn't have the various distributions and the Linux that we have today. And on the other side of that, GNU wouldn't have become what it was without the contributions from Linus Torvalds and his people. So you really wouldn't have one without the other. I think that they're both necessary in this entire realm of things, to be honest.
Now, I'm all for giving, all these developers credit for their contributions to Linux and distributions and the software that we use today. But I'll get to that in a moment. What do you think about this, Shaggy?
You have to really define what an operating system is. Take away X server, take away all these things. The core of an operating system would be a kernel, and it's very limited userland things to interact with it. That's how you're going to define what Linux is as an operating system. Not GNU, not KDE, not all these other things that you toss into it. So the core of this operating system can be defined as GNU/Linux. I think that's the basis of almost all the argument. But it still comes down to the argument of what a naming convention really is. Are you calling it Linux because it's a kernel, or are you calling it Linux because it's the ecosystem?
Swath, what do you think?
Well, obviously, I'm in agreement that that GNU deserves some form of recognition, and I pretty much also agree with the point that trying to get people to go back to saying GNU/Linux now is just about going to be a lost cause. So I don't really have a problem these days just saying Linux, but I think it's important for especially like prominent people that promote Linux, like Spatry, that Linux users are at least educated. And I think the GNU thing isn't strictly just like the GNU tools or that the Linux kernel was able to hedge together, but other things that came from like GNU, like the GNU public license, which even though software has been forked off away from the original GNU code, so much of it is still released under that GNU public license. So all that software still at least pays some homage to the GNU project, just if not just for the licensing that it uses.
Toss today.
As a, by the way, Spatry, I think it's Swave and not SWAT. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so on behalf of Spatry, I apologize. Yeah, but
sorry,
no,
Swave.
Honest mistake. As a channel that runs, videos, information for newbies, my job is to tell Windows users, yoo-hoo, try Linux. So, I try to keep it as uncomplicated as possible, obviously. For my personal view, to me, it really doesn't matter if I started calling it, GNU Linux or just Linux. It's not that big of a deal for me. So, but for my channel, it might be easier just to keep doing what I was doing. Now, I understand here, now somebody mentioned how much GNU was in the latest, versions of a Linux distribution. I personally don't know, but I understand where we should give credit where credit is due. And maybe one of these Zoo Crew nights, maybe we should just do a quick history of, of Linux there, Spatry, and give credit where we can, give the credit all in one night of talking.
Absolutely. And, and the thing is, I'm all for giving credit to the GNU project. I'm all for giving credit to the people who make our video drivers. I'm all for free and open source software. So how about this? And I'm making a call out to all developers out there who design and create their own distributions. Why, instead of worrying about how we're going to name this or what we're going to be calling this, whether it's Linux or GNU Linux or whatever you decide to call your distribution, how about having a simple harmless pop-up window the first time after somebody installs your distribution onto their system that has a little message, a little disclaimer that says, we would like to thank the following developers of these technologies. We'd like to thank the GNU project. We'd like to thank all of these technologies that our system employs, and have a nice, friendly, thoughtful message to all of these developers out there, that you give credit for all of these things that are out there.
I think now, though, with YouTube and the internet, anyone who uses Linux you're very soon going to come across this debate. And I think most Linux users in general, I saw the inquisitive type, and they're going to do the research. Like, if you start looking up Linux, you're going to be looking it up on YouTube. You're going to come across Richard Stallman and Linus Torvalds and references to Revolution OS. So It's hard to say. Like, developers aren't going to, I guess, not want to put pop-ups, but I just try to mention it where I can. But as Total OS today says, like, you can't sort of bamboozle them with a million acronyms and terminology.
Yeah, it's always best to keep it, simple, and for me, that's my philosophy in both Linux and when I'm running Windows 7. But I do have one last question, comment or question for Sway. Do you use Linux distribution exclusively?
At home, yes, I'm a full-time Gentoo user.
Okay, and you're perfectly happy that it's just called Gentoo or Gentoo Linux, I would imagine?
Yeah, and as I said earlier, in 2013, we're usually referring to various distributions just by the name that they're given, like Ubuntu or Debian. The actual word Linux is getting used less and less, but I mean, I owe a lot to GNU because obviously I have to use GCC to compile everything that I install.
Okay.
Now, Armageddon wanted to point out, though, that credit for the GNU project and other projects are in the manual pages in the help pages that come with the distributions.
Yes, that is true.
Now, I'd like to throw a little wrench into this. Okay, there are some distributions on the Free Software Foundation website that are in the true sense of GNU. Okay, these are distributions that do not contain any non-free software. Okay, and it's my understanding that some of these distributions won't even let you install non-free software. They are completely free as in freedom. These distributions are titled like Blag, Dragora, Dynabolic, GNU Sense, Musix, Parabola, which is like Arch, but without any
all the
non-free.
famous ones, yeah, sure.
Triskel or Utoto XS. Each of these distributions have the blessing of the Free Software Foundation, and I would consider these as GNU Linux distributions. Now, personally, I would define Linux as distributions that use non-free software or have non-free applications available. And some of you may disagree with me on this, but we're talking about like your drivers that you would need for your network card or video card, Steam for gaming. I use non-free software in Wine. I paid good money for it. And because I switched to Linux, does this mean I must throw it away to please Richard Stallman? What about freedom to choose what kind of software I run on my machine? Sure, free and open source software is a good thing, but I'm sure you will agree with me, Toss, that some of that free and open source software just isn't quite there. And so we still want to look at proprietary software, yes, especially if we can run it under Wine.
I think we can probably sum this discussion up. It all comes down to freedom to choose paid software or freedom to choose unpaid software, whether it's one platform or cross-platform. To me, that's the definition of freedom, at least when it comes to running your computer.
This also applies to naming. If you have the freedom to call it what you want. If everyone wants to call it Linux, they can go ahead. If everyone wants to call it Kleenex, they can call it whatever they want.
Yeah, let me Kleenex my video drivers. Thank you there, Spatry. Yeah, right.
What say you, Matthew?
Well, that was one thing that I wanted to add aside of this that I haven't really considered. Earlier, someone mentioned something about the GPL licensing that these distributions use. Well, that came from the GNU project, that GPL license. And even if these distributions don't use the GNU tools, if they decide to use that licensing, then maybe they should be recognized as being GNU/Linux because they're using the GNU licensing for it. That was one angle that I hadn't really considered before.
Shaggy.
Well, I'm not sure the license would apply because then you would have to call BSD, MIT, BSD. But you can you should be able to call Linux what you want. It doesn't really matter what it is because in the end, it's the users that actually make these distros, not Linus, not Stallman. Neither of them have anything to do with it. Just the users that do it. Even though it's companies behind distros now, it's still fundamentally the users that create everything.
Swathe.
As far as the freedom thing, and I hope I say his name correctly, but Aku Base in IRC, has pointed out that, and this is what I think causes a lot of the confusion, is the definition of the word freedom. Now, I use proprietary graphics drivers, I have Steam installed, and I know that's not free software, but Richard Stallman's view on the freedom thing is a moral standpoint, and it's not a practical one, and free software doesn't actually have anything to do with what you choose to use. Like, I've tried, I think I lasted about a month, and I tried to use like totally 100% free, like I used like basic Debian, no proprietary stuff, and I lasted a month, but it was hell. So I think, and this is probably something listeners may want to go and read up on themselves rather than try to explain it here, because it can take a long time, exactly what the four freedoms that the FSF, or the Free Software Foundation, refer to in terms of freedom. But I think sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I think anything that uses the GPL license, I mean, it pays homage to GNU by using the license, and we may not have to continually point that out to people, but it's something that we should be aware of in general.
Any final thoughts on that toss today?
Let me just say that a lot of great discussion here, but my final thought is MIT BSD MOUSE.
I love it. And, you know, it's funny because I do have a video up on my YouTube channel that is MIT BSD GNU EULA Madness. I had a little bit of fun making that video where I attempt to explain the differences between the licenses. But at the end of the day, if somebody, you know, because I do get comments on my YouTube channel all the time, if somebody tells me that I must use the term GNU Linux, I wholeheartedly respect their right to, you know, call Linux in general anything they wish. In return, it is my hope that those people will also respect my right to call Linux what I feel that it is, Linux, with the exception of, you know, if I'm reviewing a distribution that has the blessing of the Free Software Foundation, yes, I will refer to those as GNU Linux, and then Linux distributions that use non-free software, I'll use the term Linux, and I think that's where I stand there. I do agree that, you know, GNU needs to get, as well as everybody else who, you know, contributes to the platform. This has been a really good discussion. I'd like to thank Matthew Moore for joining us. Shaggy Two Dope, thank you for joining us. Swathe, thank you for jumping in and joining us on the panel at the last minute. And thank you, Total West, today. Excellent discussion.
Cool, very nice.
Today's show was brought to you by the Linux Distro Community. Visit us today at linuxdistrocommunity.com and chat with us on Mumble or in IRC on the Freenode network in the Linux Distro Community channel. The Linux Distro Community. Freedom through the sharing of knowledge.